Welcome back. In this video, we'll be studying together Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. Now, as a reminder, Daniel 3 is a court tale, and it's specifically a tale of court conflict. Now, you will recall when we discussed the genre of the book of Daniel, we talked about tales of court conflict, and we made the point that these are stories in which a wise courtier begins in a situation of some prominence, but he's conspired against by his fellow courtiers, and then he falls from grace. But in the end, that wise courtier is vindicated by their once again demonstrated virtue. Well, Daniel chapter 3 and 6 are both court tales. In Daniel chapter 3, as we will see, Daniel's three friends begin the story in a place of prominence. They have just at the end of Daniel chapter 2 been promoted to the position of administrators over the province of Babylon, or in the province of Babylon. But what we see is that some of their fellow wise men, some astrologers, conspire against them by bringing their non-worship of the king's statue to his attention, and they fall from grace with the king Nebuchadnezzar, who threatens and does indeed throw them into a fiery furnace. But in the end, they are vindicated by being delivered by the angel that their God sends, because of their virtue, demonstrated in their refusal to compromise on their faith with God. Similarly, in Daniel 6, we will see later on that Daniel is in a position of prominence in the Persian court, but he's conspired against by his fellow courtiers and thrown into a lion's den, and God delivers him and vindicates him. Now, what's the point of these stories of court conflict? I think the point is, because God is the hero of all biblical stories, these court conflicts served to demonstrate God's ability to deliver his people from any dangerous situations that they would have encountered in exile. Let's talk quickly now about the literary structure of Daniel chapter 3. Daniel 3, like Daniel 2, has a chiastic structure, and you will recall we talked about the fact that a chiasm is a structure kind of like an X, because the Greek letter chi or chi, depending on your pronunciation, is kind of like in the form of an X. It's an inverted structure with parallels on either side. And so if you look at the literal structure that we have here on the screen, you will see that A and A prime are parallel. So at the beginning of the story, Nebuchadnezzar, he decrees that all the people are to worship the image that he has set up. And at the end, he makes a second decree, but this time to worship God, the God of Daniel's three friends. And then B and B prime are parallel. In the story, the Jews are accused of not worshiping the image that is set up. But later in the story, in a parallel place, these same Jews are vindicated. And then C and C prime in the story are parallel. And there you see the Jews are threatened first, which is parallel to later them actually being punished by being thrown into the fiery furnace. And then in the middle, in the place of emphasis, we find that the Jews commit to honor the one true God, even if it would possibly cost them their life. And I'm taking this literary structure from Ronald Pierce's commentary on Daniel, but you'll find it in a number of places. I think it is quite clear, this structure, and most scholars actually are able to discern it. Now, I want you to notice that the accusation and eventual vindication of Daniel and of Daniel's three friends corresponds to that literary structure we mentioned earlier, the literary genre structure, which is that there is an accusation and an eventual vindication in a court conflict. But as we said, at the very center of this literary structure is the Jews' commitment to honor their God in the face of threats to conform in the pagan environment of exile. Well, let's move now to actually read the text and to get into the story and set it up for our further study. In Daniel 3 and verse 1, we read, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. So unlike Daniel 1 and Daniel 2, this story does not begin with any time references. But since Daniel's three friends are referred to as administrators over the province of Babylon at the end of chapter 2, and they were just appointed to those posts at the end of Daniel chapter 2, then this story must take place after the events that are narrated in Daniel chapter 2. However, they could take place right after Daniel chapter 2, or maybe some years later on in the distance. So we're not quite sure. So these could be young men around the age of Daniel in Daniel 2, say about 18, or they could be older in their 20s or something. We're not exactly sure. Daniel is not mentioned in the story, and that likely is because he's at the palace in Babylon, in keeping with Daniel 2:4-9, which said that his friends were appointed administrators in the province whilst Daniel remained at the palace. But what we find in the story is that Nebuchadnezzar the king, he makes an image and he sets it up on the plain of Dura, where a dedication or inauguration or initiation ceremony for that image is being held. We're not exactly sure where this is, but Dura is Akkadian, which is the ancient language of Babylon, means fortress or fortification, and a number of Babylonian locations have that name. So the most we can perhaps say is that this is a plain outside a fortress or a wall of some kind. We're told that Nebuchadnezzar makes an image of gold. Most likely, it is a gold-plated image. In other words, the entire thing was not solid gold, but as they did in the ancient Near East, they would make the statue out of wood or stone, and then they would cover it with gold. Now, that word image is the same word selem that we would have encountered in Daniel 2 in referring to the image or statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But whereas that image was made of 4 different metals representing 4 different kingdoms, this image is made entirely of gold. Now you recall that in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. But Nebuchadnezzar's new image seems to be intended to change the outcome of the dream, because it's gold from head to toe. And that means that his kingdom is not finite and will not have an end, as was depicted in the dream, where only the head was gold and it was followed by chest and arms of silver, and then thigh and belly of bronze, and then feet of clay, representing these successive kingdoms. So I believe that what's happening here in Daniel chapter 3 is that Nebuchadnezzar is trying to demonstrate that his kingdom is not to be succeeded by any others. And it's not to have any feet of clay that will result in the destruction of the image which represents his kingdom. The king, I think, is resisting the meaning of the dream that was conveyed to him. Now, this image that he sets up, we're told, is 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide. These multiples of 6 reflect the Babylonian sexagesimal counting system. That means that they use a base 60 numeral system. We kind of find that even today in our 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, or 60 degrees, etc., etc. But when you sort of translate what those measurements would mean in our measurements today, this is an image that is 90 feet tall. This is like a 9-story building times 9 feet wide. So it's a huge, humongous statue. But it's also oddly shaped. It's disproportionate for a human figure. So it's tall but skinny. And it would look something kind of like a totem pole. But some suggest that it could be an image that was inscribed on an obelisk or stele, like a long, sleek type of looking pyramid type shape. But however you take it, some suggest that the grotesque, I think is the proper pronunciation, could be a way of mocking the pagan idolatry that is involved here. But as well, the dimensions could include a pedestal of say 40 feet. For example, kind of like the Statue of Liberty, which the pedestal on which it sits is about the same size as the statue. And then if you put the statue on that pedestal, then it wouldn't look so strange. Well, one of the questions that many people have is whether the image is of Nebuchadnezzar or it's one of his gods, say Marduk, or who was the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon, or whether it was a statue of Nebu, which was the patron deity for Nebuchadnezzar himself. He was named after this god, Nebu. Well, whatever it is, this image is intended to be worshipped, because we see that the people are to bow down to the image and worship it. But it's nowhere in the passage called a god. So it could, some suggest, be an image of Nebuchadnezzar, since Mesopotamian kings set up statues as symbols of their dominion. But there's no clear reference to the image being worshipped in verses 5 to 7. And but there is a clear reference to the image being worshipped in verses 5 to 7, and Babylonian kings were not worshipped as gods. So most likely, this is an image of a Babylonian god, since Babylonian kings were not worshipped as god. Either way, it was a test of loyalty to the king. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, God, king, and nation were closely intertwined, and they supported each other. And so to worship the gods of the king was a show of loyalty to the king. As Joe Sprinkle writes, whether the statue is the king or a god, it symbolizes the deification of the state, either through its national deity, gods, or royal leader. Kings demand absolute loyalty. Worshipping the statue was in effect a loyalty oath. So even if the image was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, falling prostrate before it would imply an acknowledgement of his God, as Nebuchadnezzar's fallen prostrate before Daniel in Daniel 2:46. The same exact words that are used there would have implied an acknowledgement of Daniel's God. But I think the essential point is, as Sprinkle points out, whether we're dealing with a statue of the king or of a god, the image represented the making of the state of Babylon something to be worshipped, either through a representative image of Marduk or different gods or the king. And what the king really wanted by setting up this statue was to ensure that everyone was absolutely loyal to him. And so what he was doing with setting up the statue was in effect instituting an oath of loyalty for all of his subjects. A fairly insecure pattern of behavior, if you think about it. But Nebuchadnezzar was not only seeking loyalty for loyalty's sake, but he was seeking to firmly establish his kingdom in the face of the dream from chapter 2, which told him that it would pass from the scene eventually, and more than that, that all these human kingdoms would eventually be destroyed by a kingdom of the God of Daniel. So, as one writer, Greg Goswell, puts it, the king's action is to be understood as an attempt to prevent the vision becoming reality, namely, the replacement of his kingdom by subsequent kingdoms. God had revealed in Daniel 2 that he would set up and he puts there the Aramaic word, a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. But Nebuchadnezzar's reaction is to set up same exact Aramaic words as in Daniel 2:22, when it says that God would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar's reaction is to set up an image. And then he continues, in other words, God's effective rule as king over all the nations, which was the substance of the dream in Daniel 2, is resisted by Nebuchadnezzar, who seeks to ensure the loyalty of his subjects and to bolster the strength of his kingdom by commanding that they prostrate themselves before the golden image that symbolizes his glorious empire. And gospel suggests that it's not an idol as such. I may disagree with the last bit there. But the essential point is that Nebuchadnezzar's statue is not only an effort to strengthen his kingdom, it is in effect a resistance to the kingdom of God. So when you put Daniel 2 and 3 side by side, what you see is Nebuchadnezzar, by erecting this statue, is seeking to resist the clear implications of the vision that human kingdoms would be destroyed. He's trying to, by obtaining the loyalty of his subjects, to portray that his kingdom is going to last forever. Well, as Joyce Baldwin puts it, the incident represents the conflict between worship of the true God and the humanistic use of religion to boost the world power, to boost the power of the rulers of this world. And so the conflict that we see in Daniel 3 is a conflict between God's kingdom and the kingdom of man. And think about Daniel 2 and the statue, and the sense that we have all these human kingdoms which represent one monolithic edifice that is destroyed by a rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, which represents the kingdom of God that was going to destroy all these kingdoms, and then it was going to remain forever. And so between Nebuchadnezzar representing Babylon, we have a conflict between this king Nebuchadnezzar representing the state of Babylon and this human empire, and that conflict is with the God of the three Jewish boys or young men that we find in the story. This conflict is a battle for the loyalty and allegiance of these three Jewish young men. The question is, will they give their loyalty to the king by worshiping his statue, thereby being unfaithful to their covenant with Yahweh? Or will they be faithful to their covenant with Yahweh and preserve their loyalty and allegiance to him by defying the king and refusing to worship his statue and refusing to pledge allegiance and loyalty to Babylon, its king, and its religion? This is a conflict that we also face in our daily lives in this world. This is a conflict that we face in this world where we live as exiles like Daniel and his friends in an environment that is hostile to our faith. And politics, religion, economics, and the choices that they force upon us are therefore ultimately a choice quite often between our loyalty to God or to the gods of this world. And in Daniel 3, we see an example of how three young Jewish men stood up to this type of pressure and maintained their loyalty to Yahweh. I think this is supposed to serve as an example for us, and we are to learn from them how to deal with similar challenges that we face in our present world. Well, in our next video, we will pick up again in Daniel 3 and verse 1, but we'll study further all the way up to verse 7. I hope you'll join us then.